I want to welcome you all in this discussion in cooperation with the Hans Seidel Stiftung of the Athens office about the hybrid dimension of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Although what we are witnessing is a full-scale, brutal, traditional war, the like of which we thought we would never again see after the Second World War. We're very happy to have with us for this discussion Kapellou. She's the director of the Athens office of Hans Seidel Foundation. Good afternoon, Mrs. Kapellou. We have Florian Hartleb. He's the managing director in the Hanse Advice Foundation in the Tallinn, Estonia. Good afternoon, Mr. Hartleb. Mr. Triandafyllos Karatrantos, he's a research fellow at ELIAMEP. Good afternoon, Mr. Karatrantos. Mrs. Elena Lazarou, she's a research fellow at ELIAMEP and also the head of External Policies Unit of the European Parliamentary Research Service. Good afternoon, Mrs. Lazarou. Panayotis Tsakonas, he's a senior research fellow and head of Foreign Policy and Security Program at ELIAMEP and also professor in the University of Athens. Good afternoon, Professor Tsakonas. We are waiting to join us, but he was a little bit late. Mr. Lutz Guellner, he's the head of strategic communications at the European External Action Service. We will be waiting for him, but we will begin our discussion. And first of all, I want to give the floor to Kapellou, the director of the Athens Voice of the office of Hans Seidel Foundation, to have the first introductory remarks. Ms. Kapellou, the floor is yours.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ, Odin. Καλησπέρα από την Αθήνα.
Good afternoon from Athens. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Hans Seidel Foundation at today's event on hybrid threats and how the European Union can shield and protect its members from them. Both countries and civilians. The issue of hybrid threats is not a new one. We have had some recent instances with the instrumentalization of migration, etc. But now hybrid threats are taking on new dimensions since Europe is confronted with a hybrid war through the Russian war in Ukraine. In Ukraine, there is a propaganda war and war of fake news that is raging, but also within Russia, a virtual reality is being presented to Russian civilians. I would like to thank you for participating in today's event. Let me also thank the European and Foreign Policy Hellenic Foundation, ELIAMEP, for our cooperation.
Remarks. And I want to begin this discussion by going a few years back, by going in 2014 in the annexation of Crimea by Russia and Russia's hybrid warfare strategy. And I want to give the floor to Mr. Karatrantos to explain us what was and what is exactly Russia's hybrid doctrine and the implementation in Ukraine beginning in 2014, so that we can see the whole scale, the full scale of this war that we are witnessing now in Europe. Mr. Karatrantos.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss about this very, very broad term. We have a lot of different approaches to hybrid threats, since it's covering what we're calling the zone between peace and war, because we don't have only the military dimension of hybrid threats, so what is called the hybrid warfare, which is linked mainly with the hybrid doctrine of Russia and what we are observing in Ukraine, not only in our days, of the last month with the military invasion from Russia, but as you said, it was actually the first phase of this attack against Ukraine from Russia going back to 2014. And it is something really broad, first of all, and is not only a doctrine operated from Russia, but is also including as the terms of factors, so in a number of different actors. First of all, states. So we have the case of Russia as the country that has structured doctrine of hybrid warfare, the so-called Gerasimov doctrine, so which is covering different dimensions of warfare, starting from disinformation or misinformation to supporting civil unrest and rioting, or using of paramilitary groups and troops, and finally, in some cases, and hopefully nowadays, with a full-scale military attack. So it is not only the states, but it is different actors, non-state actors in some cases. For example, one very famous hybrid actor is type of cyber hacktivist, for example, as Anonymous or other group of people, or in some cases, it could be only a single hacker that could produce a number of attacks at different agencies, either governmental or critical infrastructure. So first of all, it is an issue that is affecting, and it is being used from state and non-state actors. Also, the targets are not only states, are not only governmental institutions, but also we have cases of attacks and very severe attacks in transnational corporations, for example, big companies, firms. We have cases when the attack is against a critical infrastructure, and that's why in this very broad term, we don't have only the attack or the operation from one state or another actor against another, but we have also the cases of the so-called insider threat. So someone from inside, it could be an employee in a case of an organization, or someone that is involved, for example, in the policy making, in the strategy dimension, that could be responsible for a case of a sabotage or an espionage against a firm or a governmental agency that could be used in case of this type of intervention. So, secondly, the aim of a hybrid operation is, first of all, to create distrust. So, to create fog. We are discussing about attacks and initiatives that are mainly at the gray zone. So, sometimes they don't want to leave a foot track. So, the actor does not want to be recognized as involved in this case. So, for example, we have the so-called little green soldiers in Ukraine in 2014. So the little green soldiers are not little at all. There are typical paramilitary groups without any flag, so we cannot recognize them as ordinary military troops, but as paramilitary groups that are involved in this case. So we are discussing about hybrid threats using Ukraine as the so-called the most typical experiment of a country affected from those type of attacks and initiatives, going back to 2014, when we have a kind of a full-scale hybrid attack, because as you said before, we have civil unrest that leads finally at the annexation of Crimea and to the situation in the eastern Ukraine with the so-called regions of Donbass, when we have supporting of rioting and counter Ukrainian dimension mass movements from people that are supporting the case of affiliations with Russia. The first dimension was that. The second dimension was the heavy attack with disinformation campaigns and conspiracy theories that are mainly targeting the case of trust to political elites. That was actually the first version of our day's main argument from Vladimir Putin concerning the aim of denazification. So they are trying back to 2014 to describe the Ukrainian mass movement against the decision of the ex-president Yanukovych to not sign the agreement for cooperation between Ukraine and EU. This leads actually to a big mass movement from Ukrainian people, the so-called Euromaidan movement against this decision, which was brutally handled from the government, from President Yanukovych, with many Ukrainians killed from actual shots against them from the police and the military forces. supporting President Yanukovych. So according to the doctrine, they have to be far-right people, so all of them. They are blaming them as Nazis. They are blaming them as people that are not supporting the actual principles of democracy in order to delegitimize them, in order to prepare the breeding ground for those inventions. Secondly was the annexation of regions and the situation in the eastern Ukraine. We have numerous attacks against critical infrastructures, either in Donbass, either in Crimea or in other cities in Ukraine. So attacks mainly against critical infrastructures and cyber critical infrastructures in order to facilitate this feeling, this perception of insecurity and distrust. And we have also physical attacks and cases where they capture the control of critical buildings, especially in the two regions of Donbass. And finally, we have the involvement of paramilitary groups, and finally, from typical military forces. So that's somehow the whole description of what is happening. It is very, very important because we don't have just actions or initiatives from one actor. So it is not something that could happen once, but it's also linked with a number of other important issues for Europe and the West in general. We have a lot of other cases where there are some points for possible hybrid intervention. For example, US elections in 2016, or the case of the referendum for the Brexit in UK, or other cases. We have a very broad spectrum of possible interventions. And also really important because we have one illiberal regime, the case of Vladimir Putin's Russia, which has an official strategic doctrine concerning the hybrid warfare. For them, is not something that could be used once, an ad hoc version uses, but it is something linked with the heart of the doctrine of Russia. So it is somehow controlling, leading the operations, the military operations, as we have in our days, that where we have a second battleground, which is the cyber attacks in different critical infrastructures in Ukraine. That's why we have, for example, an operation that the main messages from President Zelensky is through cryptographic platforms as Telegram, so not the typical means of communication, but other means that could be online and not affected from a case of a cyber operation.
Thank you, Mr. Karatrantos. So, if we listen very carefully to what Mr. Karatrantos said, 2014 was the breeding ground for the war, for Russia's war against Ukraine in 2022. But Russia's doctrine began many years before, and I want to come to you now, Mr. Hartleb, about Estonia. Estonia was one of the first, that's for sure, one victim of Russia's cybersecurity attack. She enforced it against Estonia in 2007. Could you tell us how that evolved? And then we will get to Professor Tsakonas and Ms. Lazarou to see if European Union and NATO understood very well what Russia's Putin was beginning to do against Europe. Mr. Hartleb, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. The question is about the turnaround. Is it really 2014 or was it earlier? Because now also in Germany, the point is also that many people, decision makers, politicians are saying Putin just got crazy suddenly. But is it really true, basically? Because the point is that we can speak about a longer development. And in Estonia, for example, the point was basically that there was a cyber attack already 2007 after the Bose statue against the so-called victims of fascism were changed from the city center a bit outside of the capital of Tallinn. And it was clearly a cyber attack against Estonia against the state. So the bank systems didn't work for a couple of hours, and it was clearly motivated against the former member of the Soviet Union. And so the question is really when this aggression from Russia has started. And when I was confronting, I'm living in Estonia since 2014, when I was confronted with basically the issue when this started, and we have to take in account that there's a long-time strategy. What people like Garry Kasparov already said many years ago, that there's a long-time strategy from Russia against the West. We are talking also about the media such as Russia Today and Sputnik. And now basically it came to a senate of a long-term development, basically, I would say. And Estonia was warning, but when for example, German tourists and business delegations were coming, they said, yeah, it's because of the past, because in this case, Estonia was a victim of the Soviet occupation, and they didn't take this warning too serious. And even also after 2014, as you said, the annexation of Crimea, even then it wasn't taken too serious. There are close ties from the so-called Putin understanders in Germany, from social democrats, from the left, from the right-wing radicals. And there's also a big lobby for Putin, which made everything difficult. Plus, there's also a big dependence concerning the oil and energy. This is also went bigger even after 16 years chancellorship of Angela Merkel. So basically now we are talking in Germany about how to get the independence in terms of energy and oil. And this is not a question about today and tomorrow, about all this disinformation war which is going on. You have to be very worried about.
Thank you, Mr. Hartleb. Now, Professor Tsakonas, do you think that the West has perceived in the right way the threat, the hybrid threat by Russia? And maybe not only by Russia, but now we are talking about Russia because she's in war with Ukraine. Has the West understood how big the threat was from 2007 maybe, or even before that?
Well, thank you. If the West refers to NATO and the European Union, I would say that the problem in perceiving hybrid threats in a common way does not simply, by the European Union and NATO, does not simply relate to the nature of or the scope of the two organizations, but to the very to the content of the term hybrid threats, which has become a kind of a buzzword. Meaning it is about almost everything. So given that there is no widely accepted definition of what hybrid threats is about, and given that there is still an unambiguous, it is clear that there is still hybrid threats has no unambiguous definition, but it is an issue that it continuously evolves depending on the circumstances and debates. It was quite difficult for both organizations to come up with a concrete and holistic idea about what hybrid threats are and what are the particular actions both organizations should undertake for dealing with hybrid threats. For example, NATO has recognized that the changing security environment requires a broader perspective of an armed attack, meaning that has taken political form in two summits of NATO in Warsaw. In NATO Wales Summit in 2014, and again in NATO's Brussels summit in last year, where NATO has highlighted that Article 5 could also be called upon by a NATO ally in response to a hybrid threat. The European Union, on its part, I would say that it has adopted a more broad approach in understanding and in dealing with hybrid threats, and this has been reflected in the EU joint communication in June 2016, and again in also the EU's global strategy in 2016, where the need for cooperation between those two institutions, NATO and the European Union, has appeared as a necessity, I would say. So the two organizations had decided to go forward and draft in 2016 and again in 2017 a common set of proposals and actions that has resulted in actually in 17 concrete actions, which were meant to implement the objectives that were laid down in the joint declaration in 2016. And countering hybrid threats is undoubtedly one of the main areas of cooperation between the European Union and NATO, meaning that at least 20 out of the 42, 44 proposals promoting relate to countering hybrid threats. So it is important to note that these proposals regarding the dealing of hybrid threats on the part of the West, that is both NATO and the European Union, has referred to particular actions which have in turn focused on 5 particular thematic areas. One should mention situational awareness, strategic communication, crisis response, resilience, which is the new big issue for the world, and of course cybersecurity defense. And to conclude, so far it seems that an assessment of those proposals and actions proposed by the European Union and NATO has indicates that some of them did work and can be continued, while others have partly worked. So further improvement is indeed possible. For in general terms, I would say EU and NATO cooperation in countering hybrid threats has worked so far, but it has also improved in recent years through the establishment of various institutions, most notably the Helsinki-based European Centre for Countering Hybrid Threats, which plays a key role in as the hub for sharing information. The staff-to-staff contacts between the two organizations, the sharing information between the existing institutional frameworks and bodies, such as the European Union Hybrid Fusion Cell, the NATO Hybrid Analysis Branch, the EU Hybrid, of course, Center of Excellence. However, one must also refer to a lack of cooperation in the area of situational awareness so far, which has not progressed in the sense that both sides, both NATO and the European Union, had a shared threat assessment. And this is quite important for how best to come up with strategies in dealing with hybrid threats. And the same, of course, applies to the cybersecurity and defense area, in which the identification of potential synergies in responding to cyber threats has not yet been operationalized.
Thank you, Professor Tsakonas. And now I want to give the floor to Ms. Lazarou. Ms. Lazarou, you heard what Professor Tsakonas said about a different kind of assessment of the threat between NATO and the European Union. Where do we stand now? Has the European Union understood well how big the threat is? I believe there is, she's going through an act, the Digital Market Act, and has that to do with how the EU will respond to this kind of threat, the threat of our times?
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here. I have to say, listening to Professor Tsakonas speak, a lot of what I wanted to say has already been said, since he spoke about the West, so both the EU, NATO, and others. But also, in my understanding, it was not so much a different perception of threats that he alluded to, but rather the lack of coordination, or rather established cooperation in the area of joint situational awareness and intelligence sharing. So in many ways, my first comment would be that both the EU and NATO, when one looks at the last decade, and I would argue a bit more of actions, have really put hybrid threats on the one of many that they have put on the top of the list of threats to address through action. It's just that the coordination between the two, which has been dramatically increasing and I think exponentially through the joint declarations in 2016 and 2018, and what we're expecting possibly a third joint declaration this summer, keeps adding domains and areas in which cooperation will increase, and strategic communications and fighting disinformation, which are part of this hybrid threat response, are part of those. But indeed, there will be more done, I think, and Professor Tsakonas is right that sharing intelligence is definitely something that should be there. But to respond to your question about the EU and how important hybrid threats are in its various toolkits, and I use the plural here because when one looks at hybrid threats, I was thinking about it. It's really impossible to say which exactly domain of policy one should look at anymore. And when one thinks of the European Commission, a range of acts, actions, and strategies across Directorates General, and in the Parliament where I work, across committees and subcommittees. And by the way, in the current legislature, we're now coming to an end of a temporary committee in Parliament, which is specifically created a committee on fighting disinformation and other types of foreign interference. So really the work is all across the board. But the work is not recent. The emphasis on hybrid, I would say, is not recent. Many of the speakers have said that it started with and earlier than the annexation of Crimea. And I would argue perhaps that 2008 is a good place to start with Russia's instrumentalization of various phenomena in Georgia to create the conflict that it created there. It's important to remember that at the time, Russia's economy and its military were weakened substantially. And at the same time, that region of both the Caucasus and the Eastern Partnership were really looking very attracted to both NATO and the EU. And so militarily, it may have been difficult at the time for Russia to confront those large organizations. However, I think a number of analysts who work on that region identify two things. One, that if Russia used different types of warfare in that area, it was not clear yet in NATO and in the EU which were the tools to respond to and where the area of competence ended. And secondly, that there were separatist tendencies in those areas that, if taken advantage of, both in terms of societal manipulation, but also economic coercion or economic manipulation, then there were benefits to be gained. So I think that moment, even though hybrid warfare, I think, is an ancient concept, I think of that as of that moment, I think we can think of, the last phase of the beginning of the last phase of hybrid warfare. And indeed, save for that time where the EU is really focusing, let's not forget, on the economic crisis. I think from 2013, when security and defense comes on the agenda very much, then hybrid is on it already. And we see it, as Professor Tsakonas has said, in the global strategy. We see it in the joint framework on countering hybrid threats, which already creates an emphasis on Stratcom, on strategic communications, and I'm sure we'll hear about this in a minute, because it really looks at a three-pronged approach, which has to do with raising awareness, building resilience, and also preventing and responding to crisis. And it's really also at that moment when the EU starts to reflect, as does NATO a bit earlier, do the provisions that the treaties or the charter have with respect to solidarity and mutual defense and assistance in the face of non-conventional threats, do these apply when we are in the face of hybrid warfare and hybrid attacks? And this is also, by the way, when EU-NATO coordination starts to get stronger in that area, so 2016. But that is that part of it. I think because you mentioned the Digital Market Act, and I just want to step on that to take it a bit further. When one looks at the Versailles Declaration, and this is the declaration the leaders adopted 2 weeks ago in an informal summit, hybrid threats are mentioned, and three things are mentioned in the context of how to fight them. One is fighting disinformation. The other one is protecting critical infrastructure. And the third one is creating cyber resilience. And this gives us a sense of the range of responses that are on the table at the moment. And the range of responses goes even beyond this cyber security and disinformation spectrum that we tend to think about when we think about hybrid warfare. It also goes into economic coercion. It goes into the manipulation of access to critical infrastructure, not only in the cyber domain, but also economically. And I would argue that what we're seeing today is hybrid warfare also in the sense of weaponizing supply chains, weaponizing energy trade or energy supply. So the weaponization is essentially everything. So the response of the EU to that is indeed, as Professor Tsakonas said, resilience, but that resilience is diffused across policy areas. And I would argue that we see it, and I will end here, we see resilience critically in the EU's process in becoming a more robust security and defense actor in the domain of defense, and the recently adopted strategic compass outlines a number of ways to build resilience across domains. We see the building of resilience in the supply chain weaponization response, which is also a response to a hybrid threat, through a number of legislative initiatives, including the anti-coercion instrument, the way foreign subsidy manipulation is an act to counter foreign subsidies, and also the effort to diversify supply chains, including energy is a very interesting example, and food. And we also see the building of resilience in the way the EU is working on societal resilience, and here a lot to do with education, with media literacy, with countering disinformation, with fact-checking, but also by preventing malicious cyber actors and platforms which are not malicious but can be used to facilitate the diffusion of disinformation through algorithmic manipulation and other elements. And that's why I come back to your question. Yes, I think all these Digital Market Act, the DSA, the DMA, initiatives that have to do with the cyber environment, the EU Cybersecurity Act, all of this is work that is regulatory, but really addresses that element of hybridity in warfare, which is really how platforms and how cyber technology can be used by those actors. So it's across the board. I find that countering hybrid threats is a societal, regulatory, and institutional effort that the EU is carrying out in collaboration on many levels with NATO, I would argue also with the G7 in many areas. And we will see in the future also which other multilateral fora, because hybridity has also become an issue of huge concern to other like-minded countries across the world, because hybridity, apart from coercing, also aims to address and to weaponize public opinion, democracy, and other elements that these countries hold dear. So I end here.
Thank you, Ms. Lazarou. And now I want to welcome, we have with us now, Mr. Lutz Guellner. He's the Head of Strategic Communications in the European External Action Service. Good afternoon, Mr. Guellner. I'm very happy that you could join us. I know that these are very, very hectic days for you. And we're ready for your statement. And by asking you also, as Ms. Lazarou said, should we feel safe in the European Union? Are we enough resilient to counter these attacks by Russia, and maybe in the future, not only by Russia?
Yeah, so thank you very, very much. And all my apologies for being late to this fascinating conference, at least what I heard. And I'm really, really sorry that I missed kind of the previous speakers, in particular, Professor Tsakonas. All my apologies for that. It is indeed very, very busy here, and I spare you all the details. But we are working exactly on those different elements that Elena just mentioned. So it is maybe a bit the practitioner's point of view that I can give for this discussion here. So I will focus a bit more on the disinformation element here, of course, always in a hybrid context. And maybe the starting point of all our reflections need to be quite careful with the specific use of words, because disinformation is actually a phenomenon which is much bigger than hybrid threats. It's also a societal issue. It's about our new forms of consuming information, and of course the entire system around technological systems of having access to all this information. And yes, of course, we also have an issue, a societal issue in disinformation, in also false information, in misinformation as well. So the unintentional kind of spread. And also here, the European Union is working on this. I'm happy to expand on this, but I would like to focus on the aspect that you're focusing on here in this conference, and that is the hybrid threat element. It's the foreign and security policy element that is so important in this context. And there we actually prefer using another term, and I hope I'm not confusing you much further, but we prefer the term information manipulation. So in particular, foreign information manipulation and interference, because this is the threat that we are seeing. This is the form of interference, of activities also that we see in particular from foreign actors, mostly state actors, but not always, because even organizations like Daesh, for example, are using some of these activities. So how does that look like? How do we need to understand it? And I think the unique feature of this threat, and I hope I'm not repeating what previous speakers have said already, but for us it's very important, is that there is a state or a state apparatus. It's never an entire society, it's usually kind of parts of a state apparatus that is using this. It is state coordinated, state organized, state controlled, also these activities. It is not about kind of what we call maybe public diplomacy or robust communications, or some people call it the battle of narratives, but about a very, as I said, coordinated and systematic activity that is to a large extent planned, that is to a large extent used kind of for very strategic purposes, and that is to influence, to undermine, to accompany kind of situations like we see now with the Russian war in Ukraine. And that is fundamentally different to the broader picture of disinformation, where we need to see, okay, how do these things travel? Why do people share certain things? What do we do about unintentional kind of disinformation, etc.? But here we speak about state activity, and that makes it a hybrid threat for us. That makes it a hybrid issue that needs to be addressed, that needs to have also specific responses. I will say a few words about which responses we believe are important in structural terms, but also in practical terms. But very, very important to use this conceptual approach, because if we don't know what the threat is, it's very difficult, or if we cannot define it, it's very difficult to find the necessary policy responses, the necessary policy tools also to address it. And here I would agree very much with Elena, at least what I've heard here. And of course, also, let's never forget the hybrid nature of information manipulation is also nothing new. Something that has been used for hundreds, if not for thousands of years. But what is new is obviously the technological means that are there. It is cheap. It is relatively easy to do. Yes, it gets a bit more complicated, but very often we see let's call it malign actors, have an arm's length kind of head, kind of are ahead of us, let's call it like this, because there are permanently changing kind of approaches, permanently changing techniques and tactics that are being used. And if you look, for example, at operations that were still happening in not too long ago, in 2015, 2016, look at the US elections, for example, where we saw massive amounts of bots, for example, we see already quite some changes. The war in Ukraine has changed this a little bit. I can say maybe a few words about this in a moment, but in principle, what we look at is kind of this systematic use of a whole set of instruments, in particular now of the Russian state or the Russian apparatus, that ranges from so-called legitimate tools, so very classic public diplomacy and state media or state-run, and controlled media, to a kind of an obscure area of so-called information portals that are not real information portals, that often have direct links to the even to the Russian secret services. I think all this is fairly clearly documented, and then into covert operations inside the social media, for example, with manipulation at 3 levels. The first level is obviously manipulation of content, of either material, text, pictures, etc., images, audiovisual. But the manipulation, and that is my point that I really want to stress, can also happen at the level of identities. We see a lot of so-called outlets, actors that are not real, that have been constructed, networks that have been constructed kind of artificially with false personae, with false identities, to make people believe that these are people who have opinions, but they don't have opinions because they are not real people. And let's also not forget that part of this toolbox, let's say, of the actors, is also an approach of manipulating the reach. So the way how certain narratives, the way how certain debates, etc., are amplified, how they are kind of made bigger, how they're dominating, is also part of this manipulation. I don't want to be too long. That's why only 2 additional points. The first one, what can we do about this? And then maybe as a last point and kind of look ahead or at the current situation. So what we learn from the current situation. So what we can do about this is basically we can put it in 4 boxes. If I can use a bit of schematic and conceptual approach, at least that's how we see it. The first box and first area of activity is complex in itself, is called situational awareness, as Elena has mentioned already. Situational awareness has many forms and shapes. It's not only about tracking and tracing, it's also about awareness raising, it's about detecting, it's about exposing, it's about a good insight of who is doing what, but also showing kind of to either inside the governments, for example, kind of raising awareness, what are these actors doing, but also to the public, because all this is, at least also what my team is doing, is very much open source based, and we want to show, that there is a problem, that there are malign activities, that we can detect them, that there are many, many NGOs out there and researchers that see the same, and that we do have a problem in the future. The second box also mentioned is a huge one, and I think Professor Tsakonas has also mentioned it. It's the resilience. But the resilience has many also different forms and shapes. It ranges from a better, not only the societal awareness, but also in concrete kind of work in terms of media literacy, in terms of preparing also structurally, inside the member states. And if I can mention this, there are many EU member states that have invested massively over the past few months, in any case, in building new structures. Look at Sweden, for example, that has just built a new agency to deal with the issue. Look at France, which has also built a new agency, Viginum, it's called, to detect, also to be able to expose and these malign activities, plus a structure kind of also at ministerial level, to have a proper system, to detect, to react, etc. Resilience goes also with partners, working with partners. We have inside the European Union built, and I spare you all the long list because it would be far too long, but we have built one very interesting and well-functioning tool, which is called the Rapid Alert System, bringing together all EU member states, all the EU institutions, where we share basically on a daily basis insights, incidents, that we see, but also kind of approaches, how we counter it, how we go about it, etc. So all these connections are very, very important, and they include, and sorry that I only heard Elena speaking before me, but they include also quite a close cooperation with the colleagues from NATO. With my counterpart, the head of the strategic comms team in NATO, we work very, very closely, hand in hand, but even more so, and Elena has also referred to that, with our G7 partners and also others, but I just mentioned it here. The third, and I'm coming to the end because I really don't want to be too long, the third element is something that you have mentioned is, well, call it disruption or call it more kind of regulatory approaches. This is, of course, we need to look at dissemination paths or dissemination tools. And here, not so much the Digital Markets Act, but much more important is the Digital Services Act, because the Digital Services Act actually identifies kind of information manipulation and comes with a very intelligent approach. And I'm not saying this as EU official, but I generally believe in this. It does not regulate what is good, what is bad, what can be said, what cannot be said, but it approaches the issue from a risk-based approach. So what activity, what situation is a risk? And if this risk is there, what are the obligations of the platforms, to react to that? And I think this is a much better approach than to regulate kind of content or anything else. And just for the record, there's also another piece which is not a legislation, but but nevertheless an important framework, which is called the Code of Practice. My colleagues in the European Commission are working on this kind of day in, day out, just on the new version of this, which has very clear rules of the game for the platforms, to which they themselves or have committed themselves. And the last point, Odin, on this list of what we can do is of course using our foreign policy tools here as well. And I think this is where the strategic compass that many of you have mentioned already, and I just hold it in the camera because it's lying next to me here, because it's has become a very, very important document also for our work, is that we do want to develop, excuse me, that we do want to develop tools that allow us to impose costs on disinformation actors. This could be by way of a sanctions regime. This could be by other ways. We're still working on this. In the end, it will be a decision of the member states. We have seen that sanctions are possible in the case of RT and Sputnik. I think justified and clearly on a legal basis that has been identified. I just want to say It's not a ban. It is sanctions which are related to a behavior in a specific situation. And I think this could be a good kind of way ahead. Very last point, and then I stop, is the current situation, of course. We see, and I spare you a long analysis because I think you can read it also every day. What we are seeing at the moment is that in particular, the Russian state apparatus is using really all the assets that it has at the moment. Really all these different forms that I described beforehand, including a very, let's call it robust, if not aggressive, use of its own official channels. If I look at where kind of these very clearly identifiable disinformation narratives are coming from at the moment, they come from official spokespeople, they come from embassy Twitter accounts, they come very clearly from very official kind of places, let's call it like this. We call this a bit the gloves off approach. This is something new. This is something that we have not seen before in this way, and in this robustness as well. But let's not forget that additional instruments are still being used in terms of kind of undercover kind of operations in social media, and all the different kind of reports by the social media companies that actually expose them are pretty clear to that. So last sentence is, are we well prepared? I think we still have some way to go there. We still have to invest some of the good ideas you can find actually in this strategic compass, including developing something along the lines that I just outlined to you. You know, we call it the FIMI toolbox, Foreign Information Manipulation and Interference Toolbox. Obviously, this needs to go hand in hand with the work that is ongoing on hybrid threats in general. And of course, the many important initiatives also on cyber, because a lot of these kind of activities are actually done kind of in using these instruments at the same time. Look at hack and leak operations, etc., where cyber and disinformation activities go hand in hand. I stop here, Odin. Thank you very, very much for giving me the place, and sorry that I came in late to this meeting.
Thank you very much, Mr. Guellner. And also, if you feel that there is a pile of work and you need to go back, please, okay, feel free to do so. Okay, and now, Mr. Karatrantos, I want to come back to you. I know that sharp 6 o'clock, you have to leave us, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the challenges of next day. We heard very well what Ms. Lazarou and Professor Tsakonas and Mr. Hartleb and, of course, Mr. Guellner said, and I fear that a lot of work to be done by the democracies, and things are very, very more easy for fake democracies, for autocratic regimes like Vladimir Putin's. So if you could say, what is the main challenge for the future? And is there another country, I don't know, maybe China, that we should expect a kind of that hybrid doctrine like Russia's?
Yeah, thank you very much, and apologies for the reason that I have to left in a way. Actually, you are somehow reading my mind, because I have prepared one point that is linked with democracy, the challenges of Western democracies, and of course the polarization, which is actually the main outcome of the different crises that the EU member states and Western states are affecting the last years. So a very important parameter of the hybrid operations from Russia was the linkages between the far-right groups in different EU countries. For example, the case of the pandemic, it was actually a big reminder that different movements, that different anti-systemic, anti-governmental movements, as for example, the anti-vaccination movement, which is actually a kind of a combination between far-right groups and other radicalized persons, is linked and somehow are fueling from those hybrid operations, because conspiracy theories are the sharing of conspiracy theories is an important part of this dimension. So there is a very big challenge within Western countries about how we can safeguard democracies and how we can work with what Mr. Lutz said before concerning the case of counter-narratives, the case of how we can upgrade more on critical thinking and the general resilience, which is very, very important. So this is a very important tip. So the linkages between far-right groups. We have even cases back to 2014 with in a traveling from different EU countries and Western Balkan countries, because we have this dualism in this case of foreign fighters for the case for Ukraine, and they're taking part in the battlefield there. So this is very, very important issue. Secondly, we have the case, the urgent need, of course, for intelligence gathering and fusion from different areas. And this is very important because we need to include in our risk assessment also critical infrastructure. So we need to include the private sector. We have the cases also from internet providers, which is a very important dimension. So if we want to grasp the early signals, to grasp the low signals in this case, and to have an early detection, this is also very important for this situation. And finally, the most important thing with your question, yes, it is not only Russia. And this is a kind of a trap. If we Russificate the case of hybrid threats, we will miss the main problem here. It's not only Russia, it's of course China with a different way, the different way of malign influence. This is a very important term that we can use. It's the case of Turkey also. We have, for example, the crisis in Hebros, where we have issues of hybrid operations using weaponizing a mass movement of irregular migrants, in these cases, combined with a massive information manipulation, in this case, in order to delegitimize the handling on behalf of the Greek government, and the case of the stance of EU, and this is also very, very important. And finally, the turning point that we have a very important dimension where the hybrid threat, the hybrid doctrine, or for example from Russia, which is the most structured, the most organized concept of hybrid strategic thinking, is not only hybrid. We have this very traumatic case with the military intervention in Ukraine that we need to have always in our mind, that is a joint case, that is a combination of military and non-military, traditional and non-traditional, symmetrical and asymmetrical means and tools. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Karatrantos, and now feel free to leave for your next conference. Thank you so much. And now, Ms. Lazarou, I know that you also have to leave at 6:10, 5 for Brussels time. So you talked a lot about the people of the European Union, and how you can make them understand and be knowledgeable of what is happening. And I think that one of the difficulties of the European Union is exactly that, coming to the people and explaining to them how they can protect themselves and really what is happening. We saw that also in the French election with the French and with Marine Le Pen. We saw it with Matteo Salvini in Italy, and we see it also in Greece a lot of time, and the perception that the Greeks had before the Ukrainian war about Russia and Russians. So do you think that the European Union can communicate what is happening about the hybrid threats to its people, to its citizens?
Well, thank you for that question, and apologies that I have to leave soon. I hope that the EU is increasing its capacity to inform citizens. I'm sure my counterpart from the External Action Service, who is online, Mr. Guellner, feels the same. Of course, creating societal resilience is an easier phrase to say than to actually do. But if one goes back and looks at the current and the previous commission, I would say a lot of thought, a lot of acts, and a lot of financing has gone into that. There are several ways that one could mention, but just naming the names of acts like Democracy Action Plan or other such, I don't think is really the crux of what is important. I would say the following. On the one level, what we're doing, and I would argue all the institutions are doing that, and governments are also getting involved, is trying to provide fact-checked information. And here, Stratcom agencies, institutions, both on the EU level and the member state level, also in partnership with other institutions such as NATO, really, really help. But fact-checking, as many of the digital and disinformation experts that I hear in conferences say, is not just about having the structures by government to do that. It's something that citizens should internalize. We all live with a phone in our hand, and that's the easiest way for access to disinformation. So educating and media literacy, which has been mentioned by my colleague from the EAS, is really another area where I feel a lot of effort is being put in, including in collaboration with universities, think tanks, and universities. And I would add here the role of our service, the European Parliament's Research Service. Part of our work is really to write fact-based and briefings and analysis on what is going on that is accessible to citizens. And I think that's part of the work that is being done. But of course, manipulation of information is easy, and it becomes even easier in a time when citizens are feeling that they are struggling with life, and things like inflation, rising energy prices, etc., can make citizens more prone to endorse other narratives. So while the immediate answer to your question is to look at strategic communications and media literacy, the other part of it that goes hand in hand is to secure a certain level of well-being to citizens, and that here brings in initiatives to respond on the EU level to the rise of energy prices, to the securing of supplies, because obviously minds can be more easily manipulated when they are feeling that they are missing out and that their level of life is declining. Just to add one thing on this dimension, this is not just about the EU citizens. And foreign policy was mentioned. And in fact, a big part of the Eastern Partnership, so the EU's partnership with the 6 countries of the Eastern neighborhood, has been about creating that kind of societal resilience. A lot of the macro-financial assistance that has been going to those countries has gone with the objective to raise the level of democracy, to support democracy, but also to support citizen education, media literacy, and other areas of countering disinformation. So we've been doing that a lot in collaboration with countries like Ukraine and Georgia. And I should mention, for example, the recent move to quickly link up Georgia to the EU energy grid is also a way to prevent that this energy issue Moldova, that this energy issue becomes a reason why citizens will be tending to go to endorse other narratives. So there's a really big area on which one can work to build this societal resilience. And thank you very much for the opportunity, since I'll have to log off.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ms. Lazarou. Thank you. Now, Professor Tsakonas, so what is the way ahead? Things are difficult, very difficult, I would say. So what do you think are the main challenges ahead, and how can we deal with them? What Ms. Lazarou said is we saw in France with the energy prices went off because of a decision by President Macron. We saw the yellow vests, and we saw with financial crisis in Greece and also in Italy that we saw the populist rise. So a lot of challenges ahead. And how do you see that evolving?
Well, in terms of cooperation between the NATO and the European Union, we're rather focusing on those two organizations. I would say that that progress can indeed be made, but it has to be step by step and at a relatively slow pace, I would say. And Ivan touches upon a kind of a lessons learned approach, let's say, in assessing what is ahead and make a prognosis about what is ahead of us. I would say that there are still certain conditions that do not allow for the speeding up of cooperation between NATO and, unfortunately, and the European Union. And I'm mainly, or one must mainly refer at this point to the political blockades of the so-called Turkey-Cyprus problem. So this is actually one of the main obstacles that cooperation between two institutions has to face and overcome, namely the differences in membership, which one should consider as probably the most important obstacle, which, as you might imagine, it refers. It's a serious obstacle when it comes to, as it is the case with Turkey and Cyprus, when it comes to sharing sensitive security-related information, because some states only want to share information with either the EU or NATO, but not with both. An additional obstacle we are facing, we have to deal with, is the fact that the changing security environment is increasingly characterized by hybrid threats. So these threats cannot solely be addressed by military or civilian tools. A more whole of society, I would say, approach is required. And for this approach to be followed, both governments and private actors should work together along with the military and civilian tools that need to be combined, the military ones from NATO, the civilian ones from the European Union. And last but not least, an additional obstacle, I would say on a less optimistic note, but I have to refer to that. It has to do with it relates to the member state level concerning non-traditional threats, and I'm here referring to various member states of the European Union and NATO who still consider cyberspace as a critical domain of national interest, and they are, by implication, they are reluctant, I would say, to share their threat intelligence or technical information on cyber incidents or information about their national cyber vulnerabilities and offensive or defensive cyber capabilities, or to put common disposal their technical and intelligence capabilities to attribute cyber incidents. So, all in all, I would say that there has been progress. As I mentioned, further progress can be made, yet on a relatively slow pace, and it would be wise to focus on particular I would say reforms that we might introduce in regard to the cooperation between European Union and NATO. There have been many proposals made so far. I won't refer to any of them in detail, but still, Elena has left a minute ago, but I'm sure she's aware of the proposal made by the European Parliament for the creation of a common EU-NATO cyber threat information hub, which is indeed of particular importance, or other proposals made by other actors, such as the transformation of the existing NATO cyber center of excellence in Tallinn into a joint NATO-EU cyber center of excellence, and many more. I'll conclude by highlighting the fact that what is needed, what is really needed, is by all means a better division of the respective roles of the two organizations with regard to countering hybrid threats.
Thank you, Professor Tsakonas. And now to you, Mr. Hartleb. You live you are in Estonia. You are in Tallinn. NATO Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, as Professor Tsakonas mentioned, is in Tallinn. Do the Estonians feel safer? And are they afraid of more cyber attacks?
Generally, thank you very much. Generally, we have to be afraid of more cyber attacks. We have a growing development in the last years, and we see basically that the tendency to digitalize our national states in Greece, in Germany, everywhere, also as producing some risks, and this is actually what Estonia has experienced 2007 with the cyber security attack, after the state started to be digital already the end of the 90s, with a high emphasis on education, on health, and basically we have to understand, I think, in this current crisis, in this current war, that we are talking about the Darwinist challenge between the West and China and Russia. And in this Darwinist threat, basically, we have to understand that there is a toll factory of Russia since a couple of years from St. Petersburg. There is this social credit system in China. There are some tools like TikTok from China. So basically, we are in this new challenge, in this new competition, in this virtual world. We have a lot of new channels, new platforms. For example, the corona deniers, they gathered via Telegram. Telegram is basically owned from a Russian who is living in Dubai. And generally, we have to challenge these threats via platforms, via cyber attacks. And we are not prepared for that. And we see basically that this is a systematic underline from China and from Russia, and they put a lot of energy in this new virtual world. And on the other hand, from US, Facebook, etc., also is not without the risk. So we have to somehow also confront that from the European Union perspective, or from Greece, from Germany, how to deal with it. New world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hartleb, Professor Tsakonas, and all the rest, and Ms. Lazarou, Mr. Karatrantos, and of course, Mr. Guellner. And thank you all for watching us in this discussion. We will have the time to discuss that a lot in the future because the war is going on in Ukraine. Thank you very much again for watching us. Have a lovely afternoon.